For decades, the earliest known record of a romantic kiss was a set of instructions in a 3,500-year-old Sanskrit text. Then, in 2023, researchers found something older in the clay archives of Mesopotamia. Then, in 2025, a team at Oxford threw out the entire timeline. Their conclusion: kissing is not a human invention at all. It is roughly 21 million years old. That number is not a typo, and it is not a metaphor. 21 million years predates Homo sapiens by so much distance that the comparison barely holds together. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. 21 million years ago, the ancestors of humans, gorillas, chimpanzees, and orangutans hadn't yet split into separate species. There was no human mouth on the planet to press against another human mouth, because there were no humans. There was no Earth that looked anything like the one people recognize today, no continents in their current shape, no ice caps at the poles the way they sit now, nothing resembling a human settlement anywhere on the surface. And yet, according to the science, the behavior itself was already present, sitting quietly in the family tree more than 60 million years before the first Egyptian pyramid, waiting for a species to eventually exist that could give it a name. For most of history, people simply assumed the kiss was invented, a custom dreamed up somewhere, in some royal court or village or temple, and passed outward like a fashion or a recipe, the way a dance move or a greeting spreads from one culture into the next. The truth turns out to be close to the opposite. The kiss was not built. It was inherited. And tracing that inheritance means starting not with the oldest love letter or the oldest poem ever written, but with something considerably stranger, a fossilized smear of dental plaque, pulled from the jaw of a creature that has been extinct for roughly 40,000 years. So the real question this video is chasing was never really when did ancient humans first kiss. The real question is how far back the behavior goes before the word human even applies anymore, and what happens to the story once the search moves past written history, past spoken language, past the species boundary itself, and down into the deep architecture of primate behavior, all the way to an ancestor that predates the human genus by a margin most people have never had to think about in their lives. And that search matters for a reason beyond simple curiosity. Every year, biologists publish new estimates on when specific human behaviors first appeared: laughter, dance, cooking, storytelling, grief rituals, and almost every one of those estimates gets revised backward as the tools for reading ancient evidence improve. Kissing turns out to be one of the more extreme examples of that pattern, because for most of the 20th century, nobody was even asking the question using the right kind of evidence. Historians were reading texts, anthropologists were reading customs. Nobody, until very recently, was reading the actual biology, the genetic and behavioral fingerprints a species leaves behind whether or not it ever writes anything down. So what actually counts as proof when the behavior in question predates language, predates writing, and in this case, predates the species doing it? That's the real thread running underneath all 4 chapters of this video. Not just when, but how would anyone possibly know? That search starts in northern Spain, inside a limestone cave system that stretches for more than 2 miles underground, with a mouth that has not opened in over 40,000 years. In 1994, explorers moving through a cave system called El Sidrón in the Asturias region of northern Spain stumbled onto something that would eventually reshape an entire field of archaeology. The cave itself had a long, layered history, locals had used it as a shelter during the Spanish Civil War, and its limestone tunnels wind for roughly 2.5 miles beneath the hillside, but tucked into a narrow side passage nicknamed, informally, the Tunnel of Bones. Explorers found something far older than any wartime relic, the remains of a Neanderthal group, later dated to between 49,000 and 50,000 years old. Full excavation ran from 2000 to 2009, eventually recovering roughly 2,000 skeletal fragments belonging to at least 13 individuals, 7 adults, 3 adolescents, and 3 children, believed by most researchers to represent a single extended family unit. The bones told a grim story on their own. Cut marks, deliberately cracked long bones, and skulls broken open in a pattern consistent with marrow extraction led researchers, including Antonio Rosas of Spain's National Museum of Natural History, to conclude that this particular group had likely been killed and cannibalized, possibly by a rival Neanderthal band, during what appears to have been a period of severe food scarcity. It's a violent, unsettling scene, and for years, that violence was the headline. But the real information wasn't sitting in the broken bones at all. It was hiding in the teeth, specifically in the thin calcified layer of plaque still clinging to them after tens of thousands of years underground. Dental plaque, once it hardens into what's called dental calculus, becomes something close to a biological time capsule. Unlike soft tissue, which breaks down within decades, calcified plaque can survive largely intact for tens of thousands of years, locking in microscopic traces of food, airborne particles, plant matter, and bacteria that happen to be present in a person's mouth while they were alive. In 2017, a research team led by Weyrich, a microbiologist then working at the University of Adelaide in Australia, extracted and sequenced genetic material pulled directly from that hardened plaque on the L-sidern teeth. Their findings, published in the journal Nature, ended up answering two very different questions at once: what these particular Neanderthals had actually been eating, and, far more unexpectedly, who or what they might have been sharing saliva with. The dietary finding alone was enough to overturn decades of pop culture assumption. This specific group, at this specific site, at this specific point in time, wasn't eating much meat at all. Their calcified plaque contained chemical and microscopic traces of pine nuts, moss, wild mushrooms, and tree bark, strong evidence for a heavily plant-based diet, at least locally, which pushed back hard against the old cartoon image of the Neanderthal as a pure, snarling meat-eating predator stalking mammoths across a tundra. Other Neanderthal sites elsewhere in Europe show much heavier reliance on meat, so the picture that's emerging across the species as a whole is one of real dietary flexibility. Neanderthals eating whatever their specific environment offered, the same way modern human populations do. But it was the second finding buried in that plaque that actually made international headlines. Nestled inside the ancient calculus, Weyrich's team found and fully sequenced the genome of a microbe called Methanobrevibacter oralis. At the time, the single oldest microbial genome ever sequenced from any source, clocking in at roughly 48,000 years old. This organism isn't some exotic pathogen. It's part of the completely normal human oral microbiome today, quietly present between the gums and teeth of billions of people walking around right now, most of whom have never heard its name and never will. Finding it in a Neanderthal's mouth on its own wasn't the shock. Neanderthals having oral bacteria isn't exactly headline material. The shock was in the genetic clock hidden inside the microbe itself. Here's where it gets interesting. By comparing the specific mutations in the Neanderthal strain of this bacteria against the modern human strain, Weyrich's team was able to calculate roughly when the two versions split apart from a shared ancestral strain. Their estimate, somewhere between 112,000 and 143,000 years ago. Now hold that number next to a separate, well-established figure. Neanderthals and the ancestors of modern Homo sapiens are believed, based on broader genetic evidence, to have diverged as distinct evolutionary lineages somewhere between 450,000 and 750,000 years ago. That's the point where the two species family trees actually split. Do the subtraction, and something strange falls out. The bacterial strains split apart hundreds of thousands of years after the two species themselves had already gone their separate evolutionary ways. Which means something happened long after the split that brought a Neanderthal mouth and a Homo sapiens mouth into close enough, repeated enough contact for a living microorganism to jump across the species line and take up permanent residence in a brand new host population. Bacteria don't teleport. They don't cross species boundaries on their own. Something physical had to carry them across. So what's actually capable of moving something like that from one mouth to another? Weyrich herself, in interviews following the paper's release, laid out the realistic short list. Food sharing, an adult chewing something first, then passing it mouth to mouth to an infant or a weaker member of the group, is one plausible route. And it's a documented behavior in numerous traditional societies even today. Direct parental care involving mouth contact is a second. And the third, the one every science journalist in the room immediately seized on, was kissing. In order to get microorganisms swapped between people, Weyrich told reporters at the time, "You have to be kissing." She was careful in the same interviews to note that food sharing couldn't be fully ruled out as an alternative explanation. Science reporting doesn't always preserve that nuance, but the researchers themselves never claimed certainty. What tipped the argument toward intimate contact specifically wasn't the microbe alone. It was the microbe layered on top of a separate, already well-established body of genetic evidence that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals were actively interbreeding during roughly this same window of time. That's worth sitting with for a second because it reframes the whole picture. This wasn't two separate species that happened to cross paths occasionally in some prehistoric landscape, eyeing each other from a distance. Genetic evidence from modern human DNA, most people alive today outside sub-Saharan Africa carry somewhere between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genome, confirms these populations were mixing, reproducing, raising children together in some cases. Populations that are interbreeding at that scale are, almost by definition, populations in sustained close physical contact. Against that backdrop, a shared oral microbe stops looking like an isolated curiosity and starts looking like exactly the kind of trace evidence you'd expect that contact to leave behind. So what's actually going on here, biologically? An entire hidden trail of evidence, sitting undetected for tens of thousands of years in a piece of fossilized dental plaque, quietly recording something about how two different species of human once interacted with each other, evidence nobody thought to go looking for until DNA sequencing technology caught up enough to read it. There's something worth pausing on here. A detail easy to rush past. The same individuals whose plaque contained this ancient microbial evidence of intimate contact with another species are, according to the bone evidence, sitting a few feet away in that same cave, believed to have been killed and eaten by other Neanderthals. Tenderness and brutality, sitting side by side in the same small family group, preserved by the same limestone. Read out of the same handful of fossilized teeth. It's not a contradiction, exactly. It's simply what the full picture of a Neanderthal life actually looked like once modern science got detailed enough to read it. Nothing about that life was simple, and nothing about it was the flattened cartoon most people grew up picturing. And El-Sidran isn't an isolated case, either. Since Weyrich's 2017 paper, additional genetic evidence has continued to reinforce the broader interbreeding picture it depends on. Modern human populations across most of the world carry measurable percentages of Neanderthal DNA, and some populations in parts of Asia and Oceania carry DNA from a third. Even more mysterious human relative known as the Denisovans, identified initially from nothing more than a single finger bone and a few teeth found in a Siberian cave. The overall picture emerging from decades of ancient DNA research is one of multiple human species overlapping, mixing, and exchanging far more than anyone assumed even 20 years ago. Genes, certainly, but evidently. Based on this specific microbial evidence, quite possibly something as ordinary and human as a kiss as well. This is the point where the story could have simply stopped, filed under compelling but unconfirmed. 112,000 years is already a staggering number for something as seemingly casual as a kiss, nearly 400 times older than the pyramids of Giza, older than the oldest known cave paintings, older than modern human migration out of Africa in some estimates. But this was only the first data point the modern search would turn up, and as later research would go on to show, it wasn't even close to being the oldest one, long before anyone was extracting DNA from fossilized plaque. Historians had a much simpler method for dating the kiss: find the oldest written description of one, and treat that as the starting line. And for most of the 20th century, that search kept landing in the same place, the Bronze Age Indian subcontinent, in early Vedic Sanskrit texts from roughly 1500 BC, which describe people pressing their faces together and sniffing with the mouth, a gesture many historians interpreted as an early, somewhat ambiguous form of the kiss. For decades, that date sat quietly in encyclopedias and textbooks as the working answer to when did the kiss begin, repeated so often it started to feel less like a hypothesis and more like settled fact. Then, in 2023, two researchers challenged it directly, and in doing so, rewrote the opening chapter of the kiss's written history. Troels Pank Arbel, an Assyriologist at the University of Copenhagen specializing in the history of ancient Mesopotamian medicine, and Sophie Lund Rasmussen, a zoologist and ecologist affiliated with the University of Oxford's Wildlife Conservation Research Unit, published a paper in the journal Science arguing that the historical record had simply never been read completely. The evidence, they wrote, had been sitting in plain sight site for over a century, scattered across tens of thousands of cuneiform clay tablets recovered from Mesopotamia, the region covering modern-day Iraq and Syria, that nobody had specifically cross-referenced for descriptions of kissing. What they found pushed the confirmed written record back by roughly 1,000 years, from Bronze Age India all the way into the much older civilizations of the ancient Near East. Clay tablets written in Sumerian and Akkadian, two of the very earliest written languages in human history, and dated to at least 2500 BC, describe kissing across several distinct social registers: a maternal kiss placed on the forehead, a warm kiss shared between friends, and, described in language that leaves little room for ambiguity, a romantic and sexual kiss shared between lovers. One mythological text from this period, composed in Sumerian, describes an encounter between the goddess Inanna and the god Enlil, framed explicitly around physical desire and a kiss on the mouth, recorded plainly, in a matter-of-fact register, the same way a court record or a diary entry might note it today, rather than veiled in poetic metaphor that later readers had to squint to interpret. Here's the detail that turns this from a dry historical footnote into something with genuine stakes attached: kissing, it turns out, leaves behind more than a literary trace. It leaves a medical one, and ancient Mesopotamian physicians appear to have noticed the pattern thousands of years before anyone understood germ theory. Arbel pointed to a disease described repeatedly across cuneiform medical texts under the name bushanu. The symptoms, recorded by ancient physicians nearly 4,000 years ago in remarkable clinical detail, describe boils forming in and around the mouth, alongside a name whose root implies something about odor, suggesting the ancient physicians directly associated the infected person with a distinctive, unpleasant smell radiating from the affected area. When Arbel and Rasmussen compared these carefully described symptoms against known modern viral profiles and cross-referenced them with ancient pathogen DNA extracted from preserved human remains, the overall symptom pattern lined up disturbingly well with a virus still circulating through nearly every human population on Earth today: herpes simplex virus 1. The virus responsible for the ordinary cold sore transmitted almost exclusively through direct mouth-to-mouth contact and the exchange of saliva. Arbel was careful, in interviews following the paper's release, to flag exactly where the evidence gets thin. Ancient disease concepts, he noted explicitly, rarely map cleanly onto a single modern diagnosis. And Bushanu was very likely describing a cluster of related symptoms rather than pointing to one single, isolatable pathogen the way a modern lab test would. As with all ancient disease concepts, Arbel said, they do not match any modern diseases one-to-one, and one should be very careful when applying these modern identifications. That caution matters, and it's worth repeating rather than smoothing over for the sake of a cleaner story. But the broader argument at the heart of the paper never actually depended on nailing one ancient disease to one specific modern virus with total precision. It depended on something a level simpler, and honestly more convincing, as kissing became a documented, openly described, explicitly named behavior across the Mesopotamian written record. A parallel wave of illnesses started showing up in that same record. Illnesses whose described transmission pattern, mouth-to-mouth, saliva-borne, close and repeated contact, matched the behavior almost perfectly. The ancient scribes weren't only recording affection between gods and lovers. Without realizing it, they were also recording the earliest known documentation of an epidemiological pattern, cause and effect, sketched out in clay, 4,000 years before anyone had the vocabulary of virology to explain what they were actually seeing. But there's a footnote buried in this chapter that Arbel and Rasmussen were explicit and unusually candid about, and it quietly undercuts the entire premise of treating first written kiss as a meaningful origin point at all. William Jankowiak, an anthropologist at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, who was not involved in the 2023 study but was consulted by journalists covering it, pushed back on the framing directly. Written records, he pointed out, survive almost exclusively from complex, literate, class-stratified societies, the kind of civilizations that had scribes, palace administrations, and archives capable of preserving clay or papyrus for thousands of years. Foraging bands and smaller-scale societies, which made up the overwhelming majority of human existence for the overwhelming majority of human history, tens of thousands of years, compared to Mesopotamia's roughly 5,000. Left behind no comparable written trace of anything, kissing included, whether or not the behavior was happening constantly within those groups. Finding the earliest written kiss in Mesopotamia doesn't necessarily mean kissing originated in Mesopotamia. It might only mean that Mesopotamia is where someone first had a reason, a writing system, and the archival infrastructure to put it down on record. That distinction between the first kiss and the first documented kiss turns out to be the hinge the entire rest of this story swings on. Every civilization that leaves behind clay tablets or papyrus scrolls is, almost definitionally, a civilization with cities, hierarchy, and specialized labor. That's a tiny, unusual sliver of how humans have actually lived across the full span of their existence on this planet. So if the written record can only ever measure literacy, not affection, then the only way to find something resembling a real starting point is to stop looking at written history altogether. And that's precisely the reasoning that sent one team of researchers looking somewhere written history could never reach in the first place. It's also worth noting how strange it is that this correction took until 2023 to arrive at all. Cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia have been sitting in museum collections and university archives for well over a century. The British Museum alone holds tens of thousands of them. Assyriology, the academic field devoted to reading and translating these texts, has existed since the 1800s. What changed wasn't the existence of the evidence. The clay tablets describing kissing between Inanna and Enlil had technically been translated and catalogued for decades before Arbol and Rasmussen's paper. What changed was that nobody had specifically gone looking across that enormous body of translated material with the deliberate, narrow question of does this describe kissing in mind. Sometimes the biggest historical corrections aren't the result of a new discovery pulled fresh out of the ground. They're the result of someone finally asking an old archive the right, oddly specific question. That pattern, evidence sitting untouched for a century, waiting on the right question, is going to repeat itself again in the very next chapter, on a scale so much larger that the Mesopotamian correction starts to look almost modest by comparison. If fossilized dental plaque could already push the timeline back past 100,000 years, and if the entire written record was arguably only ever measuring literacy rather than measuring affection, then the only way to find something resembling a true starting point was to abandon human history altogether and go looking somewhere far stranger. That was the exact logic behind a 2025 study led by Matilda Brindle, an evolutionary biologist at the University of Oxford's Department of Biology, published in the journal Evolution and Human Behaviour. Brindle's team set out to do something that, remarkably, nobody in the field had systematically attempted before: build a full evolutionary reconstruction of kissing across the entire primate family tree, using the same rigorous statistical methods biologists routinely apply to trace the evolutionary history of a physical trait, a wing shape, a color pattern, a particular bone structure, but applied instead to a behavior. Kissing, from a pure evolutionary biology standpoint, is a genuinely strange thing to try to explain, and this is worth pausing on before diving into the method. It transmits pathogens, as the Mesopotamian Bushanu record already demonstrated 4,000 years before modern virology existed. It requires sustained proximity and trust in a way that carries real cost and real vulnerability. And critically, it offers no obvious, direct reproductive benefit of its own, no clear survival advantage that would make natural selection favor kissing over any number of alternative bonding behaviors that don't carry the same disease risk. That combination makes kissing what evolutionary biologists sometimes call a genuine puzzle, a costly trait that nonetheless persists and spreads, which usually signals that it's quietly doing something valuable that isn't obvious on the surface. Brindle's team gathered observational behavioral data across a wide range of primate species, screened against a specific working definition of a kiss, non-aggressive contact between the mouths or mouth regions of two individuals that does not involve the transfer of food. That last condition mattered enormously for the analysis, because it's exactly what separates a kiss from simple food-sharing behavior, the same ambiguity that had already complicated the Neanderthal plaque evidence in Chapter 1. Then, using that behavioral dataset, the team mapped which species do and don't display the behavior onto the known genetic relationships between those species. Applying a statistical method called Bayesian phylogenetic reconstruction run through specialized software called Bay Straits. Stated simply, if researchers know which species kiss today, and they know precisely how closely related those species are to one another based on genetic distance, they can calculate the statistical probability that a shared ancestor also displayed the behavior, and produce an estimated window for roughly when that ancestor was alive. The results placed the origin of kissing-like behavior in a common ancestor of the great apes living approximately 21.5 to 16.9 million years ago. That ancestor predates gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, and humans existing as separate, distinct lineages at all. According to the reconstruction, the behavior was already present in that single shared ancestor before any of those familiar species existed individually, which means it was inherited, not independently invented, by essentially every branch that split off afterward, and only lost outright in a small handful of specific lineages along the way, for reasons the study doesn't fully resolve. This is the first time anyone has taken a broad evolutionary lens to examine kissing, Brindle said following the study's release, and it's a genuinely notable gap in the research record when you consider how much attention evolutionary biologists have poured into other primate social behaviors over the decades. Brindle's team didn't stop at the broad ape lineage, either. Using that same statistical framework, they specifically tested for the probable presence of kissing behavior in Neanderthals, treating them as a distinct branch within the same phylogenetic model. The result? A Bayesian probability estimate of roughly 84% that kissing was in fact present in Neanderthals as a species-typical behavior, a figure that lines up strikingly well with Weyrich's entirely separate microbial evidence from Chapter 1, produced 8 years earlier using a completely different research method, built from nothing but ancient DNA pulled out of fossilized dental plaque in a Spanish cave. Now here's the pattern interrupt worth sitting with. Two completely independent lines of evidence. One built from ancient genetics, one built from a statistical model of modern primate behavior projected backward through time, landing on the same basic conclusion, approached from two entirely different directions, using two entirely different toolkits, published nearly a decade apart by two different research teams who weren't setting out to confirm each other. That kind of convergence is about as close to genuine scientific confirmation as this kind of deep time behavioral question is ever realistically going to get. So here's roughly where the broader picture stands once all of it is laid side by side. Bonobos are documented engaging in kissing with open mouths and active tongue contact, specifically in contexts tied to sexual arousal and to reconciliation behavior following social conflict within the group. Chimpanzees kiss as well, though typically serving a somewhat different social function. Researchers describe it as an assessment behavior, a way for one individual to gather chemical, tactile, and olfactory information about another, including, some researchers suspect, information directly relevant to evaluating a potential mate's compatibility. Orangutans and gorillas display versions of the behavior too, in their own species-specific contexts, and running the genetics backward through all of them together lands on a shared ancestor that lived closer in time to the mass extinction event that wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs than to the appearance of the very first anatomically modern Homo sapiens. Bonobos, in particular, are worth a closer look here, because their version of the behavior complicates the tidy idea that kissing is simply a proxy for romance, the way it tends to function in most modern human contexts. Bonobo society is famously organized less around aggression and more around sex and physical intimacy as a general-purpose social tool, used to diffuse tension, reinforce alliances, and repair relationships after conflict, not only between potential mates. Open-mouth kissing, tongue included, shows up inside that broader toolkit, deployed in moments that have nothing to do with reproduction at all. Two bonobos who've just had a dispute over food, for instance, reconciling minutes later with exactly this kind of contact. That's a genuinely different function than the romantic exclusive framing most people default to when they picture a kiss, and it suggests the ancestral version of this behavior may have started out serving several overlapping social purposes at once, long before any one species narrowed it down to primarily signal romantic or sexual interest. Chimpanzees complicate the picture in a different direction. Their kissing behavior leans more toward what researchers term an assessment function, closer to inspection than affection, though the two aren't always cleanly separable. A chimpanzee engaging in this kind of contact appears to be gathering information, tactile feedback, and quite possibly chemical or hormonal cues carried in saliva that hint at another individual's health, fertility, or general suitability as a social or reproductive partner. If that interpretation holds up under further research, it edges toward a genuinely practical original function for the ancestral behavior, not sentiment first, but assessment first, with whatever sentiment humans eventually layered onto it arriving somewhere later down the evolutionary road, once the behavior had already been circulating in the species for millions of years. Which means the honest, unvarnished answer to when did ancient humans first kiss isn't really a human answer at all, and framing it as one may have been the wrong question from the very start. Humans didn't invent this behavior, didn't stumble onto it through trial and error, didn't slowly develop it the way they developed agriculture or writing or the wheel. They were simply born already carrying it, fully formed, the same way they were born already carrying opposable thumbs, or trichromatic color vision, or an instinctive flinch reflex to a sudden loud noise. It arrived pre-installed roughly 21 million years before there was a human mouth anywhere on Earth for it to belong to. But if the underlying capacity for this behavior really is that ancient, and that consistently present across nearly the entire primate family tree, a genuinely uncomfortable question follows right behind it. Why, in the present day, does the behavior disappear entirely in some human societies? Why would something apparently wired in that deep, that far back, simply fail to show up at all in a huge share of documented human cultures? That question turns out to have its own answer, and it complicates the tidy picture in a direction almost nobody expects walking into this video. In 2015, 3 researchers, William Jankowiak, the same anthropologist who'd go on to push back on the Mesopotamia framing 8 years later, alongside Shelley Volsha and Justin Garcia, set out to test an assumption that almost nobody had bothered to formally test before, that romantic, sexual kissing is a genuine human universal, a behavior present in essentially every human culture on Earth. The same way linguists treat language itself, or anthropologists treat some form of marriage, as a true cultural universal. Using a cross-cultural research database called EHRAF World Cultures, alongside a second dataset known as the Standard Cross-Cultural Sample, and supplemented by direct correspondence with field ethnographers actively working in populations not fully covered by either existing database, the team compiled data spanning 168 distinct human cultures across every inhabited continent on Earth. Their question, stripped down to its simplest form, does the actual ethnographic record show clear evidence of romantic sexual kissing in each of these societies, or does it not? The result, published in the journal American Anthropologist, upended the underlying assumption entirely, and did so by a wide margin. Romantic sexual kissing showed up in only 46% of the cultures sampled. 54%, the clear majority, showed no ethnographic evidence of the behavior at all. And to be precise about what that absence actually means, this wasn't evidence that the behavior was simply rare or private or quietly undocumented by outsiders who weren't paying close attention. This was evidence that trained ethnographers, many of whom had spent years embedded directly within these communities, studying daily life in close detail, never once observed or recorded the behavior happening in any context across the entire span of their fieldwork. The regional pattern that emerged was striking on its own. Every single society sampled from sub-Saharan Africa, the overwhelming majority of societies sampled across New Guinea, and every single foraging and horticultural society sampled from the Amazon basin showed no ethnographic record of romantic kissing whatsoever. Jankowiak, describing his own reaction to the finding years afterward, put it about as plainly as a researcher can: "You wouldn't believe it. It seems so natural." The historical anecdotes buried inside this research are, in their own way, even more striking than the raw statistic. When the Thonga people of southeastern Africa first witnessed European colonizers kissing in 1890, their documented reaction wasn't curiosity or amusement or mild confusion. It was recorded as outright disgust. The behavior read to them as strange and unhygienic, something closer to an act of contamination than an act of tenderness. A century later, researchers working directly with the Mehinaku, a horticultural society located in the Amazon basin, documented something remarkably similar: no romantic kissing present in their behavioral repertoire at all. Despite the Mehinaku maintaining their own elaborate, well-developed physical customs of affection, including the practice of biting each other's eyebrows as a specific specific gesture of closeness and intimacy between partners. Meanwhile, in Melanesia, early ethnographers recorded that the Trobriand islanders, once they'd been exposed to the European kiss through contact, regarded the gesture as what one source at the time described, almost dismissively, as a rather bland and pointless form of amusement. Not offensive, exactly, just strange and oddly unsatisfying compared to their own existing customs of intimacy. So, what actually predicts whether a given culture developed the practice at all, and which ones didn't? Jankowiak's data pointed towards something specific and, on reflection, fairly intuitive, a strong statistical correlation with social stratification. Kissing, across his sample, showed up significantly more often in societies organized around distinct social classes, functioning market economies, and formal writing systems, which happens to describe precisely the kind of complex, hierarchical civilization that also happens to leave behind durable written records for archaeologists to eventually find, looping directly back to why Bronze Age Mesopotamia and Vedic India both show up so early and so clearly in the written historical trail covered back in Chapter 2. It isn't necessarily that stratified societies were the ones who originally invented the behavior from scratch. It may simply be that stratified societies were the ones positioned, structurally, to formalize it, elaborate on it, ritualize it, write about it in surviving texts, and eventually export it outward to the rest of the world through trade routes, conquest, organized religion, and much later through mass media and film. Jankowiak was also careful, in his published work and in follow-up interviews, to directly reject one popular biological explanation for kissing that had circulated for years in both academic and pop science circles, the idea that kissing exists primarily to allow potential partners to exchange scent and chemical cues, functioning as a kind of built-in biological compatibility test wired into the species. If that theory were actually the primary driver, he argued, it becomes very difficult to explain why roughly half of all documented human societies never developed the behavior at all. A genuine, hardwired biological necessity tied to something as fundamental as mate selection should reasonably be expected to show up almost everywhere, consistently, not split the world roughly down the middle like the flip of a coin. His own conclusion leaned instead toward treating kissing as one of several possible cultural expressions of intimacy and sensuality available to any given human population, a behavior humans are clearly capable of and appear to be primed for at a deep evolutionary level, but not one that any specific culture is guaranteed to actually land on, develop further, or retain over generations once early forms of contact and exchange with other groups begin, which creates a genuinely strange, layered picture once all 4 chapters of this story are placed side by side and examined together. The underlying biological capacity for this exact behavior appears to be at least 21 million years old, considerably older than the human species itself, by a margin that's almost impossible to hold in the mind comfortably. The genetic evidence strongly suggests it was very likely happening between 2 entirely different species of human, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, at least 100,000 years ago, quietly recorded in a microbe nobody thought to look for until modern sequencing technology made it possible. The first clear, unambiguous written descriptions of the behavior appear roughly 500 years ago, etched into Mesopotamian clay by scribes who had no idea they were also documenting the earliest known outbreak pattern of a virus still circulating through nearly every human population today. And yet, in the present moment, an estimated majority of documented human cultures across the historical and ethnographic record show no evidence of the behavior functioning as a romantic or sexual practice at all. The capacity is ancient, practically universal, in fact, across the broader primate family tree, present in species that split apart from the human lineage tens of millions of years ago. The expression of it, on the other hand, plainly is not universal at all. Somewhere between a shared ancestor that lived 21 million years ago and the world as it exists today, roughly half of humanity picked the behavior up, developed it, ritualized it, and eventually exported it outward, and the other half, as far as the surviving record shows, largely never did. There's one more piece of modern research worth folding in here, because it circles all the way back to the disease transmission thread first raised in Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, and closes the loop with real numbers instead of ancient inference. A controlled study of modern couples examining the actual bacterial exchange involved in kissing found that a single 10-second intimate kiss transfers, on average, roughly 80 million bacteria between 2 mouths. The same research found that couples who kissed more frequently developed measurably more similar salivary microbiomes over time, their mouths, in a very literal, physically documented sense, becoming more alike the longer and more frequently they kept doing this. Which means the mechanism the Mesopotamians were unknowingly documenting in their Bushanu records, and the mechanism Weyrich's team found evidence of in fossilized Neanderthal plaque, isn't some ancient vanished process. It's the exact same biological transaction still happening in millions of human mouths today, fully measurable, fully quantifiable, running on the same basic principle it's apparently been running on for 21 million years. None of this makes the kiss feel any less meaningful. If anything, laid out this way, it does close to the opposite. A gesture this biologically costly, this exposed to disease transmission, this evolutionarily unnecessary on paper, offering no clean, obvious survival advantage that would guarantee its persistence, surviving intact across 21 million years, surviving across an actual species boundary with the Neanderthals, surviving a near total collapse and rebuild of human culture, language, and technology somewhere along the way, and still showing up today in roughly half of every society anthropologists have ever systematically studied, is not a small thing to have carried forward. It's one of the oldest continuously surviving behaviors passed down by anything resembling a human mouth, stretching back to a point in Earth's history that predates the human genus by a margin so large it barely registers on a normal timescale. There's a reasonable objection worth naming directly, rather than smoothing over for the sake of a cleaner ending. None of the physical evidence assembled across this video, not the fossilized plaque, not the ancient microbe, not the phylogenetic statistical model built from modern primate behavior, can actually prove with total certainty that any two specific individuals, Neanderthal or otherwise, were kissing rather than simply sharing food mouth to mouth while feeding an infant, or engaging in some other form of close physical contact entirely. That gap in certainty is real, and it's worth taking seriously rather than glossing over. Every researcher directly involved in this story, from Weyrich to Arbel to Brindle, has acknowledged that limitation openly, in their own published papers and in interviews, rather than overstating their findings for a punchier headline. But the layers of evidence converge from too many genuinely independent directions at once: genetic timing data, statistical behavioral phylogenetics, disease transmission patterns recorded in ancient clay, and confirmed cross-species interbreeding evidence, to comfortably write the whole thing off as coincidence. So the honest answer to when did ancient humans first kiss turns out, in the end, to be something close to a trick question. Ancient humans didn't start it, didn't discover it, and didn't invent it from nothing the way they eventually invented agriculture or the written word. They simply arrived, roughly 300,000 years ago, already carrying something that had been passed down, quietly, mouth to mouth, ancestor to ancestor, across 21 million years of primate evolution, long before the very first one of them ever took a breath.